Hey folks, welcome back to the Contrarians. It's Marco and Nick here. We've got a little bit of a different setup today. So you're going to see that we're recording from our virtual studio. So this is the debut of our virtual studio. We hope you like it. Let us know in the comments your feedback about that. And also, what we're going to do this episode is we're going to go back to our regular format of the Contrarians, where one of us picks a dark horse album from the band and they champion that album as that band's best album against, typical opinions. So in the last few episodes, we've been doing worst album edition, but in this episode, we're going to go back to the regular Contrarians format. So on this episode, we decided to take a little bit of a dive into the Red Hot Chili Peppers catalog. And our friend Nick here has a contrarian choice on what he thinks is their best album. And I'm going to hand it over to Nick and let him describe why he thinks what his album is and why he thinks it's their best.
You might be able to tell from the album cover behind me there, but my pick is Stadium Arcadium. And I think that's a pick that probably no one is offended by, really. It's universally regarded as a good album at the very least. I don't see people saying it's their best album. And for me, it really is. It's a peak of their musical ability, and it's a really neat time in their songwriting career where I think they really did peak, and they all came together and made a really, really solid and impressive double album. Well, what do you think about that choice, Marco?
So I kind of like what you did with your pick with Stadium Arcadium. When you look at the full catalog, you kind of start to peak around the middle of the catalog. So it can't be the first couple albums. The songwriting's a little too silly. They're a little too raw. The production isn't as good. The first couple albums almost kind of sound like demos. They're very scrappy. Can't be the most recent two albums, which, Chili Peppers is a band that they don't get bad with age, right? Like you see a lot of bands, they're always like, oh, their most recent album's always like the worst album. I don't think that their last two albums are bad albums necessarily, but if you look at general rankings, they tend to kind of fall in the middle near the bottom-ish of, their whole catalog.
Yeah.
So really what you're looking at is, that album stretch that they had in the middle with John Frusciante and Rick Rubin producing and all of that. And that kind of peaks in the early mid 90s, I think, but it's pretty solid. Like it stays, I find that the quality of the albums that they were putting out is pretty consistent up to Stadium Arcadium. And really when you look at it, I mean, John Frusciante, the melodies and the songwriting that he brought to the band is really the definitive version of Red Hot Chili Peppers. That's the lineup, and the songs that everybody recognizes is from that lineup of Red Hot Chili Peppers with Rick Rubin producing. Mm-hmm. Other than the one album where John Frusciante left and then came back, and Dave Navarre kind of came and went.
Yeah, One Hot Minute. Yeah, it's a good album.
Other than that album, Stadium Arcadium, you have a whole decade of getting it right and practice to get to that Stadium Arcadium album, which was the last of that lineup. And I like that choice because it's like, you took everything before it and you summed it up in one epic conclusion of that lineup. And it's a great album. Mm-hmm. Typically with double albums, that word gets thrown around a lot, bloated. Oh, it's bloated, or, you know what I mean? They could have cut a handful of songs and it would have been so much better of an album. I honestly, even though you're the one in the hot seat, like, I don't think Stadium Arcadium is super bloated. Like, I actually enjoy it from start to finish, and I think there's a lot of great songs in it. I just don't think it's their best album.
Well, I could understand that. I mean, you're coming up against albums like Californication and Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and I've even heard there are some people who like By the Way. I don't dislike By the Way. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as Californication or Stadium Arcadium or even Blood Sugar Sex Magic. Yeah, so there are a couple of things though that I get some flack for that'll be more contrarian. I don't really like Blood Sugar Sex Magic all that much. I think it's got a really cool idea. It's like a cool idea. It's interesting for 10, 15 minutes. I don't want to listen to that album much longer than that. I don't know what it is. I used to really love it, and it just hasn't aged that well for me. Um, and to a much lesser extent, same thing with Californication. Um, when I stop and listen to it, there's only like 4 or 5 songs that I actually want to be listening to all the time and sing along to and get into that headspace. Whereas Stadium Arcadium is a double album, and almost every song on it, I will find myself, if I listen to it today, tomorrow I will find myself singing along, humming those songs to myself. All of them, through the entire day. Whereas the rest of their catalog, in retrospect, seems really great. Like, it seems so amazing and so untouchable. But when you actually go back and listen to it again today, there are little parts here and there that are lacking. There's less cohesion overall. One of the things that I think is really interesting, you talk about John Frusciante. The Stadium Arcadium is one of the first albums where I think Flea is quoted as saying that he didn't feel like Frusciante was trying to dominate the songwriting anymore, because that is something that I love Frusciante. I think he's probably the best guitarist of my lifetime, but he's a bit of a musically domineering. Like he's very opinionated on music. If you watch his interviews, he's very, very opinionated. And this, paradoxically, is the first album where he both let the group have more say musically in the writing, whereas he also started to embrace multi-tracking. And by kind of letting himself explore and do more control, the whole group was able to experiment more, and he was able to fill in more gaps. So it's their fullest sounding record. And that argument just, I think it's not really an argument, it's a fact. If you listen to any other of their arrangements, there's very little multi-tracking and overlaying. This is a sonically dense and sonically full album, but it works, and it's cohesive, and it's cohesive for 2 albums in a row, which is an amazing feat. And I think just in terms of not just that I like every single song, I respect what they did with this album. I think it's impressive. And their other albums, certainly when you take into the history of the drug abuse and the deaths in the band, they're impressive that they got them done. But like you said, this is at the end of a long run for these guys, with some little, hiccups there with Frusciante leaving and things like that. But it's the end of a long run where they have perfected their craft, and then they tried an experiment that most people wouldn't even really notice, right? Most people, when they listen to music, they're like, I like this or I don't like this. They're not listening and saying, oh wow, there's overlaying of guitar tracks, there's a synthesizer on this album. But I think people can feel it, and I think if you listen to Stadium Arcadium objectively and just open yourself up to it, you'll find that it's their best album musically.
Yeah, and it's interesting, your point that you're making, because Rolling Stone did a review of the album,
Mm-hmm.
and basically what they said was, pretty much kind of what we're saying. After a decade of being able to perfect this style and this sound, Stadium Arcadium sounds more of a summation of everything they did before, rather than a step forward creatively. And I get that, in the sense that it's like, here we are, we're writing a Red Hot Chili Peppers album, and we're going to write this epic Red Hot Chili Pepper album. You know what I mean? I think they got creative with some of the things that they did, in the sense that it's like, okay, we're going to have like Mars and Jupiter, and it's kind of like a concept and a theme and stuff like this. But songwriting wise, I feel like they weren't as creative as maybe they were before. I think their creative peak with songwriting, probably the 2 albums that I'm thinking of, which I could flip flop either or, which I would consider their best album, would be Blood Sugar Sex Magic and or Californication. I think the problem with Red Hot Chili Peppers is, they started off as this really kind of hard hitting, edgy, funky band, and then they became, into the 90s, they started becoming kind of like a pop-ish, ballady type band. And I feel like they started doing that with Californication. The ballads that they have on Blood Sugar Sex Magic and Californication, have integrity, and they're not like radio friendly ballads. Like, Under the Bridge, right, is one that comes to mind. I Could Have Lied is another one that's not like radio friendly. I feel like after Californication, then they really start to become ballady and, more poppy with like By the Way, which I like By the Way, but I do think there's a little bit too many ballads on that. And that's kind of an issue for me, because maybe I'm more used to like, typical, when you're a fan of like metal bands, like a lot of metal bands, they typically have like that one ballad on the album, and then they get back to their hard-hitting stuff, right? But with Red Hot Chili Peppers, and, with By the Way, with Stadium Arcadium, there's just too many ballads for me. And on Stadium Arcadium, like songs like If is one of the songs that is just kind of like another useless kind of throwaway ballady type song. Animal Bar is kind of another one like that kind of follows that kind of format of kind of like the song By the Way. And Animal Bar is kind of like a little baby sister to By the Way, but it doesn't quite work as much for me.
That's interesting.
As it did originally.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, because it's a much more it's a pop sounding album. Like it is a poppy sounding album. Part of that comes from the fact that when they started, like Anthony didn't really know how to sing, right? He joined the band by realizing I don't have to sing, I can just rap my poetries. A flock of poetries. Yeah, he could rap his poetry. And the reason I think that there's more and more singing as they go along is because he learned how to sing. Flea learned more and more about music. Like after Stadium Arcadium, I'm pretty sure he went and studied music theory at Berkeley. And what's really interesting too is that you can tell that they are musically, like, while it doesn't, I don't know how to say this without sounding like an obnoxious hipster. I mean, what you don't realize is that, blah, blah, blah. But like one thing, when I was taking guitar lessons, my guitar teacher was like fascinated with John Frusciante and Flea's music writing relationship, because they would sometimes write songs in counterpoint, which is an old music. Where it's loud and brash and obvious, but it is there. So when I talked about Stadium Arcadium and that willingness to experiment, that willingness to let go, I think what makes all those, and I wouldn't even call them ballads. Animal Bar I don't think is a ballad. Like it has a very soft verse, right? It does have
it starts off slow, and then the tempo goes high, and then it kind of goes back to slow again. That's why I said it kind of reminds me of By the Way. Which, if you listen to the first like 30 seconds of By the Way, it's like, oh, this is it.
Well, and to me, what I appreciate about that is masterful and a very old way of writing music, and is using dynamic range. There's actually a huge criticism for the when you're comparing the LP, like the vinyl master. Of Stadium Arcadium versus the CD master. The mastering engineer on the CD took a lot of flack, because if you actually listen to them, they sound completely different. The dynamic range is much more prevalent in the vinyl, because that CD one is much more compressed. And like personally, I get it. I've worked on sound files before. Like people want stuff to be loud, and you have to make stuff loud. There's lots of articles about the loudness war. If you're interested in music production or like a history of music, you should really look it up. It's a very interesting topic. Sorry for that digression there, but what's really intriguing about that is that those songs all have much more of an emotional punch when that dynamic range is brought back in. Because it's just human nature, right? When something is soft and quiet, it makes you feel, safe, and then when you jump all of a sudden to something loud, it gets you. It's biology, right? It has to. And
I get what you're saying, but I guess what I'm trying to say is like, yeah, maybe they had gotten good at writing that type of music like later on, but like when you go back to, I'm gonna champion Blood Sugar Sex Magic
all right,
and Californication because I think those are two solid albums. If you look at Blood Sugar Sex Magic, like you got those elements of hip hop in there. You got like songs where Anthony Kiedis straight up sounds like he's Tone Loc, you know? And I kind of dig that on Blood Sugar Sex Magic. And I also kind of dig that funkadelic type sound that they were kind of reaching with songs like Mellow Ship Slinky. Like that's just a straight up throwback to funkadelic. And I love funkadelic, and I think that those type of songs on Blood Sugar Sex Magic, they really get right.
yeah.
And sorry, go ahead.
Oh well, I was just gonna say, like even on Californication, like Purple Stain is another song in that vein that's great. You know what I mean? And I fully understand that the highs on those albums are really really hard to beat. Yeah, I guess I don't have a conceding point there. I'll let you finish your point. That's a good point. Those are very very good albums with very strong songs. Except that I just don't like Blood Sugar Sex Magic as much anymore.
Look at Californication even, because I could flip flop on either of those two albums. Like I said, Californication, right? Look at the big four songs that you have on that album: Scar Tissue, Other Side, Californication, Around the World. Those four songs. What four songs from Stadium Arcadium would you match up with those four? Like you could release. I think you could get away with putting out Red Hot Chili Peppers' Greatest Hits album or Best of, and not include any Stadium Arcadium songs, and nobody would notice. No general fan would notice that there was no Stadium Arcadium songs on it. Like you're kind of missing Danny California, right? But not only that, like if you look at the track listing on Stadium Californication, like there's a bunch of great songs on there. I like Dirt, Parallel Universe, right? Then you have like Road Trippin' and Porcelain, which are ballads, but they're more, especially Porcelain is kind of more like haunting, has that haunting feel to it.
I don't like Porcelain.
You don't like that one, eh?
It's not. I don't think it's a great song. I think there's like that's where Stadium Arcadium actually shines. Is there's an abundance of songs that you could throw up. Snow, Danny California, Hump to Bump, Charlie, Slow Cheetah, Desecration Smile, Storm in a Teacup. I mean that's 8. Like just you know what I mean. Like there's song for song. You can. There's probably none of the points on it reach the heights of like the absolute heights of say Californication, right? But I think if you start going song for song, I'd rather just hear all the hits off of Californication and maybe a few of the gems, like I Like Dirt and Purple Stain, and then and if we're talking about album to album, Stadium Arcadium, like I would just rather listen to that the whole way through. Even the slower songs like Hard to Concentrate is got a funky groove to it that's kind of fun.
Yeah.
If is a little bit a little bit slower. And what was the one you were saying before you didn't like?
Animal Bar.
Animal Bar. Yeah, I like Animal Bar. Ready Made is another great song. Like there's just so much. There's a little bit of each of the other albums that if you're nostalgic for those, you can find a song that'll remind you of that. But yeah, I do concede like the high points are not quite as high.
Yeah, and like Stadium Arcadium, yeah, like it's a double album. There's a lot of tracks on it, right? The California Red Hot Chili Peppers is no, big track lists are not new to Red Hot Chili Peppers. Their albums frequently have, like, if you look at Californication, I think it's what, like 17 tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Blood Sugar Sex Magic is what, like 15.
Mm-hmm.
Those are practically double albums.
But
You know
how
what I mean?
many?
Like, especially if you look at like Black Sabbath, with a lot of their albums were like 8 tracks, right?
Yeah.
So then, you know, Californication is double a Black Sabbath album, basically, in terms of songs. Sorry, you're.
Well, by that standard, Stadium Arcadium is like a quadruple album, right? I think it's 28
Well, Stadium
songs.
Arcadium, I think there's 24 on Stadium Arcadium, and Californication's 17. So yeah, there's a handful of songs.
Yeah.
More than Californication. Blood Sugar Sex Magic is like 15.
Yeah. But and to my point though, there's not 17 songs on Californication I want to listen to. Right? There's even with those couple songs, on Stadium that I don't want to listen to, there's still over 20 songs on that album I want to listen to, right?
I guess I'm arguing as a whole, as an album,
Mm-hmm.
like Californication, the top songs on Californication are good enough to bring up the lower songs on
Okay.
Californication.
Okay.
For Stadium Arcadium is a level field of kind of mediocrity. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say, in a sense.
See, I
But
think
if we,
I agree with what your statement. I just think that it, like, the line that Stadium Arcadium here is above the threshold that Californication is
I
on,
disagree.
and that it peaks.
I disagree. Now let's look at album sales, right? Red Hot Chili Peppers is a mega band. All of their albums are like multi-platinum, right? Stadium Arcadium was like a triple platinum album in the US, which anybody would die for a triple platinum album. But based on, you know, the few albums before that, that's actually one of the lower selling albums. Is Californication, I think, was like what, 4 or 5 times platinum. Blood Sugar Sex Magic was like 6 times platinum. Like, that's huge, man. 6 times platinum, like, that's mega numbers. Like, Stadium Arcadium is like that's a hit. And I remember when that came out, and it was a big album. But 6 times platinum, like, man, like, you can't argue with those type of album sales.
Well, I would say though that, you know, what album that was around in like the late 80s was releasing a commercially successful triple platinum album in the late 2000s, right? That in itself is an insane achievement. We have to remember, like, there are bands that in the same decade that were performing that were doing nowhere near that, right? Bands that are bigger than the Red Hot Chili Peppers that did not have that amount of lasting power.
And you can kind of sum that up to their reputation peaking in the early 2000s, but maybe their creativity wasn't. And Blood Sugar Sex Magic, like, you have an album that's reviews critically match up to the album sales. Like, you have an album that's sold really well and was reviewed very well. If you look at general consensus in terms of critical reviews, it's typically a 4 or 5 star album. Stadium Arcadium, yes, does have a lot of good reviews, but there's a lot of mediocre reviews, and there are negative reviews as well. I'm going to read you some quotes from some of these reviews that I've pulled. So you have Pitchfork's review called it bloated and self-indulgent. Prefix called the lyrics especially vapid. Stylist Mag called it mediocre and says there's a great album thing hiding in their cliche doesn't work with this double album. Pop Matters says Stadium Arcadium is capable but trounced by mediocrity. The Guardian calls it strangely empty on the inside. And I had to stop myself from adding more negative comments. I could have added probably like another 10 in my research. I had to stop and say, okay, I've got like a good 5. I'll just stick with 5.
Right. Well,
Can't find that
I
in Blood
mean,
Sugar Sex Magic.
what I would say though with that is that Blood Sugar Sex Magic is riding on the wave of alternative music being a new and a big thing, and it was popular at the time. And you got to remember, for the critics, right? I don't want to insult critics or say anything about it, but for critics, for mainstream critics at least, there's something to be said about they have to follow the trend, right? And when Stadium Arcadium was released, rock music is on kind of a decline in mainstream media. It's starting to be supplanted by hip hop. Pop music has really also kind of taken over, like bubblegum pop, right? Like actual bubblegum pop. has become kind of the mainstream of the day, and you have people who are getting tired of a sound, that ostensibly is based around the 90s and to an extent the early 2000s, right? The fact that they were able to sell an album that well in the midst of essentially being one of the last big rock bands left. Like there's not a lot of big rock bands that come after them, and even at that time, there's not a lot of them surviving. So I think that is a really big achievement just in itself. The fact that like they were able to sell half of one of their biggest albums 3 decades into their career. Well, maybe not 3 decades. My math's a little off on there. But almost 2 decades into their career is really, really impressive. And I think that speaks to the quality of the album. But we may have to agree to disagree on this one.
I think we might, and I just want to make it clear, this is the second time that we're recording this episode. We had some technical issues the first time, and the first time that we recorded this, I picked Californication as the best Red Hot Chili Peppers album. Having had the extra week to go back and listen more to things and kind of take some more things into reflection, I am going to pick Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I think that that's their best album. I'm going to make my final thought, and then I'll let you give your final point, and then I guess we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, let's do it.
But you look at the classics on Blood Sugar Sex Magic, right? Give It Away, Suck My Kiss, Under the Bridge. Those are top 3 songs on any album, right? But it's not just those top 3 songs. Like the title track rocks, If You Have to Ask, another kind of funkadelic type song. That's the one that kind of sounds like Tone Loc. Sir Psycho Sexy, like I love it. It's 8 minutes long, and I like it. I typically some songs that are that long I kind of get bored of, but I like that song. So it's not just an album of like 3 top hits and a bunch of trash. There's a lot of good stuff on Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I think that it's very consistent. With the last point that I'll make about Stadium Arcadium, I guess it is an ambitious album. It's a good album, but I feel like it's ambitious in scope, but not in substance. And that's why I'm picking Blood Sugar Sex Magic as the best Red Hot Chili Pepper album.
All right. Well, I think I was probably a little too harsh on Blood Sugar Sex Magic. It is a landmark album. It is really, really good. I just, when I went back to this last couple weeks and I sat down and I listened to their discography through and again, Stadium Arcadium is the one that I want to find out the most about, because it sounds unique to me and it sounds different out of all their discography. And to me, that expansion of letting the group really write together cohesively, and John Frusciante letting himself experiment with multi-track guitars and throwing synthesizers in, and just the peak of all that experience and that growing musicianship, I think it's their best album. I think that it's the best album in a series of amazing albums, like a really, really great discography, where even the albums that like we say we don't like, what that really means is we don't like it as much, because even an album like By the Way or Mother's Milk are great albums. But for me, I just think the most consistently and substantially impressive one is Stadium Arcadium.
We hardly talked about Mother's Milk or By the Way.
Mother's Milk would have been
that people like flip around in the top 3 or 4 albums. Mm-hmm. What are your top 3 albums?
Last week I think I said it was Stadium Arcadium, Californication, Blood Sugar Sex Magic. I'm gonna be really contrarian here and say Stadium Arcadium, Californication, and then Mother's Milk. I really like Mother's Milk. I think maybe I should have picked that one. Maybe that's another episode next year when I change my mind.
Well, we'll have to wait till next year to to get your opinion on that one.
Yeah.
But you know, for an album that's all themed about space and Mars and Jupiter and stuff like this, it does not sound like it was recorded on another planet. It sounds like typical Red Hot Chili Peppers, and in that sense, it's disappointing, but it's not bad. So
Well,
I think
we'll
probably
agree
wrap
to
it up
disagree there, but yeah.
So I think we'll wrap it up there, and say, you know, thanks everybody for subscribing and liking our videos. We've been hitting some milestones recently. I think we're at like 450 subscribers,
Something like that.
like
It's
over
crazy.
10,000 lifetime views.
Wow.
So we just want to say, you know, we really appreciate all the people that leave comments, and please leave comments and give us feedback, and, you know, debate us. You know, tell us what you didn't like about what we said. Tell us what your favorite album was. And, you know, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Also, martinpopoff.com if you want to check out any of Martin Popoff's books. He's written, I think, almost 100 books. I think it's past 75 books.
Yeah.
So he's very knowledgeable about music, and I've bought a few of his books, and I don't think you'll be disappointed.
Yeah,
So
me too.
check him out. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Hope you like the new production set.